Hello. What a marvelous conversation had in our Sunday school class about tithing. We're moving into our next segment, which is bringing our gifts to God and the gifts that we offer. And tithing was the first that we talked about. Now, the lesson did not come without any questions. There were a lot of questions. We were reading from Deuteronomy chapter 14. And we read from verses 22 through 29. So, 7 verses. A lot of questions. So I'll just jump right into it. Follow me on screen. We'll talk about tithing. Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 says this. Be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that your fields produce each year. Verse 23 says, eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place you will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. Let's just stop there and just look at those 2 verses. You know, even in Sunday school, that's when the questions really started to come. Well, what does a 10th represent? What does a 10th really mean? I think that as we were navigating this in our Sunday school class, trying to put it into literal terms, well, not so much literal, but applying it, literally applying it, is maybe what I'm looking for. What does that mean? So we started to look at terms like giving and generosity. Maybe terms like carefree. Terms like joy. What does one get out of giving? What does one get out of tithing? Now, as we move further along into Scripture, you'll see that obviously there's much more to be conveyed. Deuteronomy 14, 24 through 26. 24 says this, but if that place is too distant, and you have been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away. 25 says, then exchange your tithe for silver, and take the silver with you, and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. 26, use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or fermented drink, or anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. You know, we talked about that last line of verse 26. Just follow with me on the screen here. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. You know, as a class, we talked about the term feasting. we talked about, and oftentimes that celebration often occurs with a feast at the end. Maybe in our world, oftentimes celebration might actually have a feast smack in the middle of that celebration. We have holidays that are like that. Thanksgiving being one. But one of the things that came up, and continue to follow along, just with me on the screen here. One of the topics that was conveyed in class is that God values the tithe. There's a couple of scripture verses that I'd like to go over with you real quick that brings tithe into our reading of the Bible. For example, in Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 24, Abraham meets this mysterious priest, Melchizedek. Abraham had led a raid to free his nephew, and that his nephew was Lot. And when he returned victorious, he had many possessions. Melchizedek in turn blessed them and blessed him. And as a response to that, Abraham gave a tenth of the plunder he had won to the priest. So after sharing that story and just going back to Scripture with that piece there, we kind of understood. Okay, well that may be the basis of the tenth. Abraham laid out a tenth for Melchizedek. Going back to Genesis 14. In Genesis 27, verses 18 through 22, after Jacob sees a vision of the ladder between earth and heaven, he affirms his faith in God and promises to give 1/10 of all his possessions to the Lord. So yet again, here we are, still in Genesis, but still talking about a tenth. Jacob sees the ladder between heaven and earth. Moving further down, another story comes from out of Leviticus 27, verses 28 and 33, or through 33. God says that everything a person owns must be devoted to the Lord. Let's say that again. God says that everything a person owns must be devoted to the Lord. There was a lot of flurry of thoughts and ideas behind that one. The tithe represents this dedication. So going back, Leviticus 27, 28 through 33, God says that everything a person owns must be devoted to the Lord. The tithe represents this dedication and in turn makes all possessions of Israel holy to God. Paul affirms this. Paul goes on this in Romans 11, verse 16. If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. Moving on to Numbers 18, 28 through 32, states that the portion of the tithe goes towards the Levites and the administration of the temple. This passage connects the tithe to celebration and feasting. What a wonderful way to look at tithing. You know, having grown up in the church, having seen my parents give, you know, one of those things was that it's just something that you do. And it didn't happen until now that I was reading a segment the other day, and it says that we only know what we think we know. And I guess when it comes to tithing, I guess I only knew that, hey, this is just something that you did. And it's not really something that I investigated. But I think after this Sunday, there's a clearer understanding in what it means. Our scripture lesson talked about tithing was justice. And there were a lot of questions around how does tithing link in with justice. We'll get to that. But for the most part, let's get to this last piece. Deuteronomy 14, verse 27 through 29. It says this. Verse 27, and do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. 28 says, at the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes that years produce to store it in your towns. Verse 29, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the aliens, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied. So that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Continue just to look at the words of Scripture that are there. And just listen as I talk about this. How powerful are those words? Scripture tells us, and do not neglect. Do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. You speed this up until today. What does that represent? Kind of spells that out in verse 29. Possessions are a blessing, but the intention is not to possess us, if you will. I never thought that being possessed by our possessions would produce fear, hostility, and competition. It's something that we've all seen. It's something that we've all lived. As a student of history, we talk about that materialism. I think that as we talk about tithing, one of the seminal things that we remember is this. Jesus and his ministry was to help and aid the poor, the sick, the degenerate. That was his mission. He was bringing a gift. And so I asked I've even asked myself if that is a form of tithing. The gifts we bring, the gifts we offer. Or is that just a way of being generous? I don't know the answer to that question. I've tried to grapple with it throughout the week and tried to grapple with it even after our Sunday school lesson. In my mind, I would think that tithing is synonymous with generosity. I would think that tithing is that bond in which we are connecting and give generously. Give without caring. I think that's an important piece. It was a wonderful lesson. If you'd like to come and visit and hear our wonderful pastor, Reverend Stephen Cook, those doors are always open at Second Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee. If you'd like to come down to that middle room for the next several weeks, we're going to talk about the gifts we bring. Our upcoming lesson is going to be found in the term or the theme called allegiance, from reading of the Book of Kings. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Talk to you soon.